Hello and welcome to another Atypical Philosopher video with myself, Jonathan MS Pierce's Ukraine War Update Extra video, giving you the extra nuggets and information to get your teeth into to give you a greater understanding of the war in Ukraine. Where should we start? Lots as ever to talk about. This is an article by Phillips O'Brien in the Atlantic. I follow him on Twitter. He's a really good person to listen to and follow. People forgot how war actually works. Armed conflict is never straightforward. Weapons are not power. National identity matters. By Phillips O'Brien. Uh, he basically talks about three learning points from the war so far. So, yeah, the first lesson of the past 12 months is that war is rarely easy or straightforward, which is why starting one is almost always the wrong decision for any nation. It's a really interesting point, and it got me thinking as to what wars have been started by nations where that nation has gone on to win the war, and it's been quite easy and clear cut and has led to really positive benefits and hasn't been really difficult. And I'm really talking in the modern era here. And there aren't really many examples because even wars that you think have been decisively won have then led to really difficult situations. You can talk about Gulf Wars, you can talk about Afghanistan. If you talk about Russia, you can look at Georgia, Chechnya, and Afghanistan again. These things are fraught with issue, even if you do end up kind of sort of winning them. So he goes on to say later, and though one side in a conflict almost never simply overpowers the other, the risk of failure is especially high for a deeply flawed power such as Russia. The second lesson of the current war is that military power is not the foundation of national power, but rather the product of the economic, technological, political, and social factors that shape a nation's armed forces. Russia's invasion of Ukraine is sometimes portrayed as pitting a great fat power against a small power. In Western policy circles, the dominance of Russia experts, many of whom have spent their career viewing Russia as a regional hegemon, that means a supreme power, and its neighbors, primarily as post Soviet states, contributed to this framing of events. Russia is indisputably a nuclear power, but by virtually all other measures, it lags considerably behind its reputation. Russia's economy is seriously flawed. Its GDP ranks about 10th in the world and is less than 1/10 the size of America's. Creating much of its wealth through resource extraction, Russia makes few high technology products and indeed little else of any real value. Socially, Russia, where the population is shrinking and life expectancy is relatively low, exhibits signs of great distress. Politically, it has ossified under a dictator who has consolidated his hold on the country by tolerating corruption among those close to the throne. In fact, he doesn't just tolerate it, he's deeply involved with it to the point where apparently he is the richest person in the world and taking some 50% himself personally of certain sort of privatization projects and so on and so forth. I think I'll play you a part of a TED talk given by someone who is deeply connected to Russia. That is very interesting to give you the inner workings, possibly, of what is going on there. I say possibly because it's quite murky as to exactly what Putin is involved with and does. In other words, today's Russian military, he continues, is the product of a declining kleptocracy. Kleptocracy, like kleptomania, stolen power, not of great power itself. So yet, even observers who perceive the factors sapping Russian power underestimate their importance relative to the squadrons of military equipment that the country's decaying social structure has managed to create. Fortunately, that argument has proved impossible to sustain. He continues a third lesson. So, the argument because Russia is strong and Ukraine is weak, we should withhold assistance from Ukraine. And that argument has proved impossible to sustain. A third lesson of this war, and many others since 1945, is that underestimating the importance of national identity leads to military disaster. And I think this is hugely important in the case with Ukraine. Such judgments and doubts now look foolish. Ukrainian identity was strong and resolute from the start. Many analysts overlooked the military advantages that democracies, even imperfect democracies have over dictatorships. Although the former frequently appear messy and divided, when they are under threat, they can react more forcefully, flexibly, and intelligently, in part because their citizens feel empowered to improvise and show initiative as combat circumstances change. Remember that top-down, very centralized power structure within the Russian military, that Soviet-era doctrine that they seem to be going even more back to at the moment, is not one that breeds kind of reactive decision making that is dynamic, that can take place right down the chain of command. That pattern what has held true in Ukraine. Despite initially having fewer advanced weapons, Ukraine fought back hard, inflicting deep consequences on Russia, which has lost an estimated half of the main battle tanks it possessed at the start of the war. And those are the three lessons. So he concludes the three lessons of the past year: war is never straightforward. Power is not based on weapons. National identity has military value. Should come as a relief to supporters of democracy. The great tragedy is that they had to be relearned in the first place. And that brings me on to continuing a little bit from Timothy Snyder. Actually, I was going to do this later, but it actually fits in really well with what Phillips O'Brien was saying there. So two little segments from Snyder in his interview, brilliant interview with Frontline for PBS. He's a historian that has quite a lot to say on Russia that seems to be pretty damned spot on. Right, what does he have to say?
What do you make of that famous meeting with George W. Bush where he says he looks into Putin's eyes and he sees his soul? I mean, back then, did it matter? Did we not understand who Vladimir Putin was? Or was it not clear at that point who Vladimir Putin was?
I think the Vladimir Putin at that time is not the same person we're dealing with now, but there is a constant thread which is in a way representative of Russia. The eyes seeing the soul thing, I don't understand at all. I've never had that experience, but Putin did consistently say Ukraine is not a real country. And that has been consistently his view. And that's a typical Russian view, that Ukraine is not really a country. And the idea that Ukraine is not really a country only becomes threatening when Ukraine in some way starts to be a better country than Russia, according to measures which some Russians, at least some of the time, themselves accept, like Ukrainians can vote, or Ukrainians have had a peaceful change of president with an actual election where the votes counted, which Russians have never had, where Ukrainians are closer to Europe, Ukrainians are going to be able to travel in Europe. Those kinds of things suddenly turn Ukraine from being not a real place, a joke, which is Putin's first idea, to being not a real place, therefore some kind of concocted threat by the West. But the common idea, which is not just Putin's, that this is not a real country, that was actually there to hear way back then.
And what's going on in that time? Putin, it seems like, is trying to win over Bush. But by the time you get to the famous speech in Munich, he's describing America as a threat. What is it that turns him? Is it the rhetoric of the freedom agenda of Bush? Is it Iraq? Is it what's going on in the near abroad? What's the progression of those 7 years? So Putin comes in 2000, and by the time you get to 2007, he gives a speech at the Munich Security Conference where he says, the West is a threat. And we've talked to people who were there, and they said it was striking to see Putin describe, in rhetoric that's very similar to what he was saying in 2022 about the West. What's his progression of coming to see America as a threat?
I guess it's very important for us as Americans to recognize that the most important things that are happening in Russia are actually happening in Russia, and that the things that Putin says about us are very rarely, and if so, only distantly connected to actual things that we do and say in our
That's a really great comparison of the two countries there.
own country. That the way to understand Putin, I think, is to follow the failure of his domestic policy. Putin comes to power with the basic idea that Russia can be rigged up into some kind of rule of law state. Dictatorship of the law is the phrase that he uses. He quickly realizes that that's not the case, or at least that he's not the person to do it, and shifts gears to a different program of rule, which involves not getting rid of oligarchy, but being the top oligarch, which is a very fundamental difference. It might look the same because you're rounding up people, putting them in jail, but becoming the top oligarch, becoming the boss of bosses, turning the state into the most important mafia clan is very different than cleaning out the stables. Once Putin makes that turn,
That's a really interesting way of seeing it and putting it. But absolutely, so Putin, like I was talking about earlier, becomes, he's corrupt. But he becomes the top corrupt person. He becomes the top mafia boss of all these other mafia bosses, and that's a really big change from what he was previously in the KGB, and perhaps how he envisaged leading Russia.
that's the important turn because it means that there's never going to be effective domestic policy. Russians are not going to get the things you're going to get out of the rule of law, like social mobility, freedom. They're not going to get that. What they're going to have to get instead is a foreign policy of spectacle. So we, the West, are the enemy of choice for Putin. And the reason why we're the enemy of choice is that defining the West as the enemy feeds into a very long tradition in Russia, A, and B, it's also very safe because we're not actually going to do anything aggressive with respect to Russia. So the way to understand Putin's turn against the United States is not to feel guilty about American policy. It's not to imagine that we're responsible for everything because we're not. It's not to deny him or Russians agency because they have agency. It's to understand the failure of Putin's domestic policy and his recognition that what he needs is a kind of permanent spectacle which comes out of foreign policy, and that the Europeans and the Americans are always going to provide that. Now, when I say that, I'm not saying that American foreign policy has been good. The Iraq War was an absolute disaster, and I said so at the time. And the Iraq War has played a later indirect role in the Ukraine war, which maybe we can talk about. But what I am trying to say is that it's very important as Americans not to think that everything that Putin does is because of some little thing that we did. The most likely explanation is that what Putin is doing in foreign policy has to do with his needs in domestic policy.
When
And
Vladimir Putin
and
says, look at
oops.
the American.
And there's this idea, and it's probably from this talk that I got it from, and I talked about this yesterday, how Russia is all about looking at the negative, or blowing up these negative aspects of these foreign entities and saying, look, that's terrible. So they, but, and forgetting their own, as a way of distracting from their own lacking domestically. So it's not about creating this positivity and this positive idea of what Russia is and this positive, like, welfare system or functioning economy or whatever, right? But it's about saying, look how rubbish it is over there. It's all rubbish over there, and it's rubbish over there, and it's rubbish over there. So having these permanent bogeymen, that comparison, as fake as that may be, the comparison leaves the domestic audience in Russia with this idea that Russia is better than all these other countries, and that their lot is better than all these other the lots of all these people in these other countries, because they're being told that, oh, how terrible it is over there, and the holes are being poked, and the meddling in the democratic mechanisms, and so on and so forth. So I think it's a really interesting way of looking at it, and I'll continue that. I'll sort of serialize this as we go forward, because I think it really is a useful uh, a useful talk by a discussion by him, and the interview asking good questions as well. This is fascinating. Insignia of their uniforms. So some Russian soldiers standing around a fire here. Insignia of their uniforms indicates these are Malian and Palestinian officer cadets training at a Russian military academy, or Russian military academies in Russia. No indication they are fighting or part of Wagner. But I find this interesting. So Mali is no surprise that in the recent UN votes for calling for the immediate end to the war in Ukraine, and sort of showing that, or demanding effectively that Russia pull out, we have Mali here as one of the 7 who are against. That obviously includes Russia themselves, and Palestine aren't actually officially recognized as a nation in the UN, although many of the countries do recognize Palestine individually, but the UN doesn't. So, why do we suddenly? Is it any coincidence that we suddenly see Malian soldiers training in Russia? Yeah, probably not. There's probably some shifty thing going on there. Democratic Republic of Korea, so that's North Korea there. Obvious connections there. Belarus, obvious. Then you got Nicaragua, Mali, Eritrea. So next to Ethiopia there. So what's going on in these countries? What involvement does Russia have? And then these ones that abstained, again, what involvement does Russia have in a lot of these countries? Very, very interesting sort of geopolitical shenanigans going on. Moving from the UN to NATO, here we have the Parliament of Finland voting to join NATO at an extraordinary ratio of votes there. 184 yes, 7 no, 1 don't know what that means, and 7 I don't know what that means. One of those is going to be abstentions. I don't know what the fourth option might be there, but yeah, it's a huge majority, 184 positively in favor of joining NATO. Going to Argentina now, and I bring this up because South America doesn't really feature a lot in the kind of news pieces that I talk to you about. I mean, I have mentioned Brazil before a few times, but there isn't this support for Ukraine that exists in a widespread um, idea around the world outside of Europe, North America, and sort of Australasia, I guess. When we talk about South America, Africa, and Asia and the Middle East, there is some degree of ambivalence, or at least not wanting to get involved, got other things to worry about. It's not their war, that kind of thing. So this is why it's interesting when Argentina hears the foreign minister says that Argentina wants Ukraine war to end. Argentina's foreign minister Santiago Cafiero has said that Argentina has condemned Russia's invasion from the onset, quote, because Argentina believes that the principle of territorial integrity was violated by Russia. So actually, that's pretty important and good to see that's happened. This is James Vasquez, who's an American guy who's fighting for the foreign uh, volunteer force or foreign legion or whatever you want to call it. He is the International Legion. That's it. Uh, he is being, or at least it seems like these guys are being rotated back into action, and it's go time. He says, "I find this interesting as a video because I just think Mad Max when I look at stuff like this." So you've got a technical there, you've got a dune buggy there with a seat on the back as well. You got all sorts of stuff. Fuel tank being pulled as a trailer. Just yeah, I don't know. Just a real variety of vehicles on show. Very few of them are actually proper, legit army vehicles. So I find that quite interesting. Something to look at. Here we have Rybar doing a whole thread. I'm not really going to go through the thread particularly, but just that they're talking about this, I find quite interesting. So, mass raid of Ukrainian UAVs, drones on Russian targets, Rybar's analysis. So, on February 28th, the Ukrainians staged a mass drone raid on various targets in Russia. Ukrainian drones were seen in Tuapse and Krasnodar region. That's the one just to the east of Kerch Bridge in Crimea. Adyagir, Belgorod, and near Kolomna in the Moscow region. And they talk about all these different types of drones. You get these large drones that were kind of adapted rockets from the 70s and 80s there. You get large winged drones, more like the Bayraktar type, mini aeroplane ones, all sorts of different drones being utilized by Ukraine here. One would assume to some degree this is the same with Russia, but actually, when you're talking about going from within Ukraine to Russia or from within Russia to Ukraine, the drones that Russia are using to do that kind of thing are basically the Shahed drones, whereas Ukraine appear to be using all sorts of different pieces of kit. Great variety there. I don't know what that says. Does it possibly say that Russia's struggling to get hold of stuff? So they just have this one type that are being provided by Iran, whereas Ukraine are getting given a load of stuff from various places, or they're making some of these drones themselves, adapting older drones technology, but also there is their one of their defense industry manufacturers is making drones like the Shark drone and other long distance drones as well. So I think it does tell you there's certainly something here. Right, I'm gonna come on to another video. This is actually from the Daily Mail. I wouldn't normally, I'm not a great fan of Daily Mail, I have to say, but is the article, or at least the video that it's talking about, is how did Russia lose half of its 45,000 elite paratroopers in just 7 months? Chris Pleasance explains how Putin's generals' blunders saw thousands of cracked VDV, so these are the airborne soldiers, slaughtered, and what that means for the Ukraine war. So I'm going to join it about a minute in. It's a 5-minute video, but this gives you the intro to the VDV there, and how they're taken out. The interesting thing about the VDV is that you don't go into the VDV straight from the get go. You don't get recruited or conscripted or mobilized and then get put in the VDV for your training. The VDV take people from other units that have already been trained to give them that elite training. And the fact that they've lost so many of these is doubly problematic, because training them isn't like, you can't just replace these. You can't just get mobilized soldiers in and then, or people off the streets in that kind of mobilization recruitment drive and bring them into the airborne divisions and just train them from scratch. It's not how it works. So there's a much longer process, and you need already, decent troops that you're cherry picking from elsewhere. But anyway, this is interesting.
When Putin ordered his armies to invade Ukraine, it was naturally the VDV who were at the tip of the spear. An iconic piece of footage from the first day of the war showed helicopters buzzing low.
You kind of forget this now. It seems like so long ago, but what happened at Hostomel was on literally the first day of the war. It was incredibly important. They got absolutely spanked, the VDV, at Hostomel, and yeah, as I say, you kind of forget.
Over the Ukrainian capital as the city came under attack. These helicopters were carrying VDV units to Hostomel Airport, where they had been charged with capturing it so that Russia could land thousands more troops using the runway. 2 of the helicopters were shot down on the way in, likely killing everyone on board, while the remaining units were wiped out in a brutal firefight at the airport itself. Similar operations also took place in southern Ukraine, but the VDV were inserted too far behind enemy lines to get reinforcements and met heavier than expected resistance and were wiped out. In each case, they ended up suffering heavy losses. Having failed in attacks from the air, Russia sent the VDV in on foot. Wherever the fighting was fiercest, that's where the paratroopers went. They led a second assault on Kiev, which passed through the suburbs of Bucha and Irpin, where civilians were found massacred after Russia was forced to retreat. Footage captured in Irpin showed how Ukrainian special forces ambushed and destroyed 4 VDV armored vehicles, which can carry up to 7 men in each vehicle. 331st Guards Regiment, a unit within the VDV which has an especially tough reputation, was badly chewed up in the same area. Its commander, Colonel Sergei Sorakev, died fighting on the outskirts of Kiev in mid-March, along with dozens, possibly hundreds of his men.
And this river crossing at Bilorivka, it just, goodness me, when they get the final details out of this will go down as one of the terrible Russian points of the war. He talks about dozens of vehicles being lost. One of the OSINT counts that I remember from this, and it kept on going up, was at the very least 89. I think 89 vehicles lost in this.
After the retreat from Kiev, Russia sent the paratroopers east to the Donbass, where they were again called upon to lead the attack. British intelligence believes the paratroopers were tasked with a number of risky crossings of the Seversky Donets River, at least one of which went spectacularly wrong. While trying to ford the waterway at Bilohorivka, near the city of Lysychansk, using a pontoon bridge, the attack was discovered and shelled into oblivion by Ukrainian artillery. The bridge was destroyed, leaving some of the VDV stuck on the wrong side of the bank, forcing Russia to attempt a second crossing to get them back. That was also uncovered and hit, leaving an estimated 100 troops dead and dozens of armored vehicles and tanks destroyed in just a few hours of fighting.
As I say, not just dozens, I mean, technically that is dozens, but possibly almost 100 vehicles. Just insane.
When Ukraine said it would be counterattacking towards the city of Kherson last summer, Russia sent its best troops to defend the city. Surprise, surprise, the job once again fell to the paratroopers. Thanks to strikes by Ukrainian HIMARS, the troops found themselves cut off from easy resupply or reinforcement, stuck once again on the wrong side of a river, and with Ukrainian troops pressing in from 3 sides. What followed was months of hard fighting that eventually ended with General Surovikin giving the order to retreat from the city. But while the retreat itself was a success, as the VDV avoided being cut off and destroyed, they are thought to have suffered heavy losses in the lead-up to it. Now, as the battle swaps back to the Donbass and World War I-style trench warfare around Bakhmut, you can bet that the VDV will once again be at the thick of it.
And indeed, they're having quite a hard time in south of Kreminna in the forest, where they are meeting the Ukrainian VDV, the Ukrainian airborne troops. So it's airborne on airborne.
Obviously, losing 22,500 of your best troops isn't good news for any army, but it is especially bad news for Russia. Replacing such troops is difficult. Paratroopers are typically recruited from other branches of the armed forces or from specialist training schools. Most of Russia's military has now been badly chewed up in Ukraine, limiting the pool of recruits. It then takes months to complete the additional training required to become a paratrooper. The 300,000 men that Putin mobilized into the military last year are unlikely to make the grade.
Not everyone can punch the air. That's definitely true.
And even if the VDV can find the men it needs, it now has lost a lot of its most experienced men, which means the quality of the training the new recruits get will suffer. The war in Ukraine is far from over. There are months, potentially years of hard fighting still to go. Having half as many crack troops means Russia's generals will have limited options when it comes to where and how they can attack. And Russia must still do a lot of attacking if Putin is to eke out anything even resembling a victory. He's going to have to do it with a spear that is missing its tip.
Interesting. So you can argue about the numbers. I'm sure pro-Russians, pro-Kremlin voices will say, "Rah," but whatever you think of the numbers, they have lost a massive capacity of elite troops. That is true, and you add that together with naval infantry brigades down in Vuhledar, and you've just got a whole big mess. I think the Russian armed forces are in trouble going forward. I think when Ukraine mount their counteroffensives, there could be some trouble for the Russians, unless they've got something secret up their sleeves, unless they have got a whole bunch of equipment and personnel ready to bring into reserve now for their own offensives. I don't know. They may take Bakhmut. Well, whoop-de-doo, but how's that left you? It's but then I don't want to be like hurrah for Ukraine and get it all badly wrong. I struggle to see the positives for Russia other than being able to mobilize maybe another shed load of people and throw them into the mixer. I just don't think they've got much else they can draw on. I probably should have done this segment just after the last bit on drones. So this is Trent Telenko, just a short thread saying 2 groups of SBU special forces destroyed 6 Russian tanks in one night in Luhansk direction. So 6 tanks destroyed by drones with thermal imaging, taking out these tanks. Now, you can watch that kind of footage if you like. I'm just going to scroll on. The idea that these videos are of, quote, abandoned Russian tanks is increasingly losing to the reality that any stationary tank at night without multispectral camouflage nets and decoys will be hunted by tank-killing drones. Armored warfare has changed. So these may or may not be abandoned. There's been a lot of people pointing out that a lot of tanks or APCs and IFVs that are blown up by these IEDs dropped from drones are actually abandoned. The hatches are open and they're unmoving, look a bit rusty or whatever. Some of them been abandoned some time previously, and they get blown up because the Ukrainians don't want the Russians to be able to recover them and use them again. And they are behind enemy lines, so the Ukrainians can't get to them, so you might as well take them out. But the idea here is that, hey, they're not all necessarily abandoned, and in fact, it appears that at night there have been some armored fighting vehicles that have been taken out by these Ukrainian drone strikes. And he goes on to say the concept of air superiority below 3,000 feet is gone. The answer to this threat will not come from buying more fifth generation crude fighters. So these are like the latest of jet fighters from light air defense, which will take a decade or more to field in enough numbers. So Western tank or airfield crewmen and armies need new sets of training, tactics, and procedures to address this evolving threat. Organic platoon level drone gun jammers, camouflage nets, drone fences, and decoys are the only in the next 5 years answer, and TTP needs to reflect this. This is the idea that those things you just talked about are the only way of sorting this out in large numbers. I mean, there are other things coming on board. So I talked to you this morning about the Rheinmetall use or the prototypes of Skynets and the new generation Gepards, if you like, that they've thrown these prototypes into Ukraine to get some testing done, real world testing in a real war environment. But these, you might see an uptick in demand for this kind of stuff that was kind of phased out. Gepard, we don't kind of need that anymore. These auto cannons shooting lead into the air at fast jets is not really, a thing that we're going to need. And suddenly drones are in the zone. Oh, okay. So then Rheinmetall is now the other thing that I showed you they were doing with the surveillance, including drones themselves, camera and drone surveillance that gives you a wide network, and then once you can find out where these drones are, then use this lower tech stuff to shoot them down. But there's going to be a good deal of automation involved here. Someone was saying on one of the threads today that some of the new equipment that's coming out isn't difficult to use. The automation that's now involved, the kind of point and shoot technology that you can get on board, makes them actually relatively easy to learn to use. And we might get an evolving technological answer to this drone, but as well as needing electronic warfare to jam these things, camouflage nets, obviously, the kind of Lancet nets that you see on top of these tanks and SPGs, self-propelled guns, and as you're talking about decoys as well, lots of answers to this. You're going to see an uptick of all this kind of equipment being thrown onto the battlefield because drones are a thing. They really are a thing. Okay, just a few more minor points. 3-week battle in Vuhledar became the largest tank battle between Ukraine and Russia in the entire war, says the New York Times. The Russian Federation, this is kind of summarizing, the Russian Federation not only failed to capture Vuhledar, but also made the same mistake that cost Moscow hundreds of tanks at the beginning of the war. The Russians again advanced in columns of equipment, which the Ukrainian military destroyed from pre-prepared positions. Exploded by mines, hit by artillery, or destroyed by anti-tank missiles, the charred hulls of Russian armored vehicles are now littered in the minefields near Vuhledar. According to the ZSU, the Russian army lost at least 130 tanks and armored personnel carriers near Vuhledar. Great bit of reference to old school minesweeper there. Yeah, Vuhledar, again, like Bilorivka crossing the river, is going to be one of these things that's remembered in this whole war as a pretty terrible example of Russian military decision making. And finally, just a little bit of Darth Putin, a little bit of sarcasm here. 53 weeks in my 3-day war. I'm losing more soldiers in a week than the US lost in 20 years in Afghanistan to gain 100 meters of strategically unimportant mud per day. I remain a master strategist. Well done, Putin. So thank you for that. Thank you for watching. Please like, subscribe, and share. Really appreciate that. I'm sort of trialing out a bit of non-sling action on my arm, and I appear to be able to use the mouse just fine. So I'm pretty happy with that. Screw you, Fracture. Anyway, whatever. Thanks. Take care. Speak to you tomorrow.